blood dried stiff against rough wool, mud gripped frozen boots, dragging her down with every step away from familiar fires. Wolves did not cry for outcasts. Outcasts starved silently. Rejection tasted like ash and copper, settling deep into bones too numb to shiver. Hunger eventually outlasted every fractured tear. 3 days in the deep woods stripped away any illusion of romantic tragedy. There was no noble suffering here, only damp rot and the constant, gnawing hollow in her stomach. Maeve knelt in a patch of decaying ferns, bare fingers clawing at semi-frozen earth. Dirt packed tight under her fingernails, splitting the cuticles until pale blood welled up, mixing with the loam. She yanked a pale, fibrous root from the dirt, wiping it haphazardly on her thigh before biting into it. It tasted like bitter chalk. She chewed anyway. Her jaw ached from shivering. Unfit. Bran's voice still rattled around inside her skull, an annoying echo she couldn't freeze out. He hadn't even looked her in the eye when he stood before the pack elders. He stared at a crack in the stone floor of the longhouse, hands shoved deep into his fur-lined pockets, and declared their bond severed. He said she was too frail to survive a harsh winter, too quiet to command respect beside him. He needed a true mate, he claimed, not an administrative error by the moon. The elders, smelling weakness, had agreed. Maeve swallowed the fibrous pulp of the root and gagged, coughing violently into the crook of her arm. The sound was too loud in the oppressive silence of the autumn forest. A flock of crows scattered from the canopy above, their wings snapping like wet sheets. She hated Bran, but sitting here in the mud, shivering in a cloak that smelled of wet dog and despair, she hated herself more. She hated that a tiny, pathetic part of her chest still throbbed like an amputated limb, mourning a man who had casually tossed her into the jaws of winter. She wasn't a warrior. She wasn't going to rise from the ashes and make them all pay. She was going to freeze to death under a rotting log, and the world would keep spinning. A twig snapped. Maeve froze. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat as a white plume of condensation. She lowered the half-eaten root slowly. To her left, the underbrush consisted of tangled briars and the skeletal remains of ancient oak trees. She scanned the shadows, eyes straining against the fading gray light of the afternoon. A low, vibrating hum resonated in her chest before she actually heard the growl. It was a physical weight pushing against the damp air. Bear? No. The scent rolling toward her on the bitter wind was distinctly canine, but entirely wrong. It didn't smell like the damp, familiar musk of her former pack. It smelled like crushed pine needles, ozone, and old, cold iron. It smelled like violence. Maeve scrambled backward, her boots slipping on slick moss. She reached into her boot and pulled out her only weapon, a chipped flint hunting knife she had managed to smuggle out during her exile. Her hands shook so badly the blade vibrated. "Stay back," she croaked. Her voice sounded like dry leaves scraping over stone. It lacked authority. It lacked everything. The shadows between the oaks shifted. A massive shape detached itself from the gloom. It was a wolf, but not like any she had ever seen. The beast was monstrous, easily standing waist-high, its coat the color of a starless sky. Silver scars crisscrossed its heavy muzzle and shoulders, marking a lifetime of brutal, unapologetic survival. The wolf didn't lunge. It simply stopped, lowering its massive head to sniff the patch of dug-up dirt where she had been sitting. It sneezed, shaking its head, and then its golden eyes locked onto her. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were ancient, tired, and entirely too intelligent. Maeve backed up until her spine hit the rough bark of a pine tree. There was nowhere else to go. Her legs felt like water. "Go away. There's nothing on me worth eating." The wolf watched her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, the bones in its front legs cracked. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away. The sound of shifting was always terrible, wet, tearing, snapping joints, the heavy thud of displaced mass. When the awful noises stopped, she didn't open her eyes. She just held the pathetic flint knife out in front of her. "Put that away before you cut your own fingers off." The voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It didn't hold a hint of a threat, only a bone-deep exhaustion. Maeve cracked one eye open. The wolf was gone. In its place stood a man. He was pulling a heavy wool tunic over his head, the fabric catching briefly on the broad, scarred expanse of his shoulders. He was massive, built like a siege engine, with dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a warlord who had spent the last decade drowning in blood. "I said," he repeated, finally looking at her. "Put the stone away." "I know how to use it," Maeve lied, her voice cracking. The man paused. He tilted his head, his golden eyes sweeping over her muddy, shaking form, taking in the bleeding cuticles, the hollow cheeks, the terrifying pallor of her skin. He sniffed the air again, his nostrils flaring slightly. A sudden, jarring jolt hit Maeve's chest. It wasn't the phantom pain of her severed bond. This was sharp, electric, and terrifyingly real. It pulled at her rib cage, tugging her forward, a primal instinct screaming at her to drop to her knees and bare her throat. Alpha. Not just an alpha. The alpha. She realized who he was in the same breath that the scent of pine and iron washed over her again. Kalen, the king of the Northern Territories, the man whose border she had unknowingly crawled across to die. Instead of dropping the knife, Maeve gripped it tighter, her knuckles turning white. She pressed herself harder against the bark. She wasn't doing this again. She wasn't handing her life over to another man with authority just to be discarded when she proved inconvenient. "Don't touch me," she snarled, sounding more like a cornered raccoon than a wolf. Kalen sighed. It was a heavy, rattling sound. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, the stubble scraping loudly in the quiet woods. "You smell like dying leaves and starvation." And underneath that, he grimaced, stepping closer. "You smell like me." He closed the distance between them with terrifying speed. Maeve didn't think. She reacted. As Kalen reached out a hand, she lunged forward and slashed wildly with the flint knife. The stone edge caught the fleshy part of his forearm. It wasn't a deep cut, but bright red blood instantly welled up, dripping down to his wrist. Kalen didn't flinch. He didn't pull back. He simply looked down at his bleeding arm, then back up at her, his expression entirely devoid of surprise. "Feel better?" he asked flatly. Maeve stood frozen, the bloody knife trembling in her grip. Panic flooded her veins. She had just drawn blood from an alpha king. By pack law, he was entitled to tear her throat out on the spot. She braced herself for the strike, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the heavy impact of his fists or his teeth. It didn't come. Instead, thick fingers wrapped around her wrist. He didn't squeeze hard enough to break bones, but the grip was immovable. He calmly twisted her arm downward until her fingers went numb, forcing her to drop the knife. It fell into the mud with a soft thwack. "Sit down," Kalen ordered. Maeve's knees buckled. It wasn't entirely from his command. The adrenaline had drained out of her, leaving nothing but a hollow, vibrating weakness. She collapsed into the damp leaves at the base of the tree, curling her knees to her chest. She waited for the interrogation. She waited for him to demand to know which pack had thrown her away, why she was trespassing, why she was broken. But Kalen didn't speak. He ignored her completely. He turned his back to her, crouching down in the center of the small clearing. With methodical, practiced movements, he began gathering dry twigs from the undersides of fallen logs. He piled them up, shaved some dry bark from a nearby birch with a steel hunting knife he pulled from his belt, and struck a flint. Within minutes, a small, smokeless fire crackled to life, fighting back the encroaching twilight. Maeve watched him, bewildered. Her teeth chattered so loudly they clicked. The warmth of the fire hasn't reached her yet, but just the sight of the orange flames felt like a mockery. Kalen sat back on his heels, reached into a leather pouch at his hip, and pulled out a chunk of dried, salted venison. He didn't offer it to her nicely. He tossed it. It hit her in the shoulder and dropped into her lap. "Eat." Maeve stared at the meat. Her stomach cramped violently, a painful spasm that made her double over. She wanted to throw it back at him. She wanted to preserve some shred of her dignity and tell him she didn't need his charity. But she was starving. Dignity was a luxury for people with full bellies. She grabbed the venison with dirty hands and tore a piece off with her teeth. The meat was tough, overwhelmingly salty, and tasted better than anything she had ever eaten in her life. She chewed frantically, swallowing chunks almost whole. "Chew," Kalen warned, his voice low, "or you'll choke on it and die right here, and I'll have to dig a hole. I don't feel like digging a hole today." Maeve slowed down, forcing herself to masticate the tough fibers. She kept her eyes on the ground, acutely aware of his gaze. She hated that he was watching her eat like a feral dog. She hated that he had seen her at her absolute lowest. "You're a reject," Kalen stated. It wasn't a question. He stated the fact with the same casual tone one might use to remark on the weather. Maeve's jaw tightened. She swallowed a mouthful of meat, the salt burning the raw back of her throat. Very observant. "Pack scent is fading. You've been wandering for a few days." He prodded the fire with a thick stick, sending a shower of sparks into the dark air. "Judging by the fact you tried to stab me with a rock, I'm guessing the parting wasn't mutual." "He said I was unfit," Maeve rasped, the words tasting like poison. She didn't know why she was telling him. Maybe it was the bond pulling the truth out of her. Maybe it was just exhaustion. "He chose another, so here I am, unfit." Kalen stopped prodding the fire. He looked at her through the heat distortion of the flames. The golden glow caught the silver scars on his face, making them look like cracks in a statue. He didn't offer pity. He didn't look at her with the tragic, romantic longing the ballads sang about when a mate found their true match. He looked at her like a complex problem he hadn't asked for. "Unfit," Kalen echoed, testing the word. He let out a dark, cynical huff of laughter. They always confuse quiet with weak. The fools. He shifted, resting his forearms on his knees. The blood had dried on his arm, a dark, crusty streak over his pale skin. He didn't seem to care. "I didn't come out here looking for you," Kalen said, his voice stripping away any illusions. "I was tracking a rogue who killed 2 of my border guards. I caught his scent, followed it, and then the wind changed." He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "I smelled you, and it felt like someone had driven a hot iron spike through my ribs." Maeve's breath hitched, so he felt it too. The pull, the undeniable gravity of the mate bond. "I don't want this," Maeve blurted out. The words tore from her throat before she could stop them. "I don't want a mate. I don't want an alpha. I don't want to be tied to anyone ever again. Just let me stay here." "You'll die here," Kalen pointed out logically. "Then let me die." Kalen stood up. The sheer size of him blocked out the firelight, casting a long, heavy shadow over her. He walked over to her slowly, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened leaves. He stopped right in front of her. Maeve shrank back, pressing hard against the tree, but she refused to look away. She glared up at him, her chest heaving, eyes burning with a mixture of terror and furious defiance. Kalen crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, he smelled intensely of wood smoke, sweat, and that underlying scent of marrow and iron that made her head spin. He reached out, moving deliberately slowly, and grasped her chin with his rough, calloused fingers. He didn't force her head up, but he held her firmly, his thumb brushing over the dirt and dried blood on her cheek. "You think I want this?" Kalen asked softly. The exhaustion in his voice was so profound it physically ached to hear. "I run a territory the size of a country. I have a war on my western border and famine threatening the east. I haven't slept more than 3 hours a night in 5 years. The last thing I need is a starving, traumatized rogue mate who tries to gut me with a chipped rock." Maeve stared at him, her defiance faltering slightly in the face of his brutal honesty. "Then, leave me." "I can't," Kalen said flatly. His grip on her chin tightened just a fraction, a subconscious possessiveness bleeding through his iron control. "The moon doesn't ask for our preferences. She tied your pulse to mine. If you freeze to death out here, I will feel my own heart stop." He dropped his hand, stepping back and running a hand through his dark hair. The firelight cast deep, exhausted shadows under his eyes. "So," Kalen continued, his tone turning crisp and authoritative, "you're going to finish that meat. You're going to sit by the fire until you stop vibrating. And then, at first light, you are going to get up and walk with me back to my territory. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to talk to me. But you are going to survive." Maeve looked down at the remaining half of the venison in her dirt-stained hands. The romantic tales always spoke of a sudden, magical spark, a healing warmth that washed away all pain the moment true mates met. There was no magical warmth here. There was only a cold, damp forest, an angry, terrified woman, and a deeply tired king who was bound to her by a cruel twist of fate. But as the heat from Kalen's fire finally began to seep into her frozen boots, thawing the ache in her toes, Maeve took another bite of the tough meat. She chewed. She swallowed. She survived. For now, that would have to be enough. Morning arrived not with a sunrise, but a slow, gray thinning of the dark. Frost coated the dead leaves in a thick, crystalline crust that shattered loudly underfoot. The fire had burned down to fine gray ash. Maeve's joints screamed when she stood. Her damp wool cloak had frozen stiff in patches, grating against her thighs like sandpaper. She swallowed the stale morning air, her throat clicking dryly. Kalen was already awake. He stood a few yards away, kicking dirt over the embers, his massive shoulders tense beneath his tunic. He hadn't slept. The dark circles under his golden eyes looked bruised in the flat morning light. He pointed a thick, leather-gloved finger north. Walk. They walked. The forest offered no mercy. Brambles caught Maeve's clothes, tearing thin strips of wool. The uneven ground twisted her ankles. By mid-morning, the cheap leather of her right boot had rubbed a blister raw against her heel. By noon, she felt the hot, slick pop of it bursting, followed by the sharp sting of blood soaking into her woolen sock. She didn't stop. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, dragging her right leg slightly to keep the weight off the raw skin. She would not complain to him. Bran had hated weakness. Bran had sighed every time she stumbled on pack hunts, a sound dripping with condescension. She expected the same from Kalen, but Kalen didn't sigh. He simply stopped walking. Maeve froze a few paces behind him, her chest heaving. The silence stretched, heavy with the scent of pine resin and impending snow. Kalen turned slowly. His gaze dropped immediately to her right boot. The dark stain was barely visible against the worn leather, but a wolf's nose didn't rely on sight. "Sit," he commanded, his voice a low, abrasive rumble. "I can keep up." Her voice shook. It betrayed the lie instantly. Kalen closed the distance between them. He didn't argue. He grasped her shoulders, his hands heavy, warm, and entirely unyielding, and physically pushed her down onto a moss-covered boulder. The sheer force of him left her breathless. Before she could protest, he dropped to one knee in the freezing mud. He gripped her right calf. Maeve flinched, kicking out instinctively. His grip tightened, locking her leg in place with the immovable strength of an iron vise. "Stop thrashing," he muttered, pulling a small hunting knife from his belt. He didn't remove the boot. He sliced straight through the worn leather lacing, peeling the stiff material away from her foot. The cold air hit her soaked, bloody sock. Kalen's jaw tightened. He didn't offer empty sympathies. He unclasped a small leather pouch from his belt, pulled out a wad of clean, dry linen, and uncorked a small vial with his teeth. The sharp, medicinal sting of witch hazel hit the air. He poured it directly over the linen and pressed it hard against her torn heel. Maeve hissed, her fingers clawing into the rough bark of the boulder behind her. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and humiliating. "Don't. Infection kills faster than the cold," Kalen stated flatly. He bound the linen tight, tying it off with a swift, practiced knot. He didn't have spare boots. Instead, he took off his own thick, fur-lined leather gauntlets. He slid one over her foot, the heavy leather encasing her heel and ankle, tying the straps tightly to secure it. He stood up, his bare hands now exposed to the biting wind. He flexed his knuckles once. "Try not to drag it. You'll ruin my glove." He turned and started walking again. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. Maeve stared at his broad back, her chest tight. There was no romance in the gesture. It was violently practical. Yet, as she stood and put weight on the makeshift boot, the agonizing friction was gone. The thick fur of his glove retained his body heat, seeping into her frozen toes. The bond pulled at her, a low, rhythmic thrumming behind her ribs that synced perfectly with his heavy footsteps. It was irritating. It was intrusive. But as the wind picked up, howling through the skeletal trees, Maeve found herself stepping exactly where Kalen stepped, using his massive frame to block the worst of the cold. She hated the dependency, but she hated the cold more. They smelled the settlement before they saw it. Wood smoke, roasting meat, the sharp tang of hot iron from a forge, and the overwhelming dense musk of hundreds of wolves living in close quarters. Kalen's territory wasn't a fairy tale castle hidden in the mists. As they crested a rocky ridge, the keep revealed itself as a brutalist fortress of dark gray stone and thick timber, built directly into the side of a jagged mountain. It looked less like a home and more like a permanent warning. A heavy iron gate groaned open as they approached. Guards in thick armor flanked the entrance. They snapped to attention, their eyes wide as they took in their alpha. Then, their gazes slid to Maeve. She knew what she looked like. She was filthy, hollow-cheeked, wearing a ruined boot and a massive leather gauntlet on one foot. She smelled like a broken rogue. A tall guard with a jagged scar across his nose, Arlo, the scent of rank sweat and old leather clinging to him, stepped forward, his posture stiff. "Alpha, we didn't expect you back so soon." "The rogue?" "Dead," Kalen answered abruptly. He didn't break his stride, forcing the guards to scramble out of his path. "Send hot water and a healer to my quarters. And food. A lot of it." Arlo's eyes darted to Maeve, his upper lip twitching in a faint sneer of confusion. "Sir, the holding cells are—" Kalen stopped. He didn't yell. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply turned his head, his golden eyes locking onto the guard. The air pressure in the courtyard plummeted. A heavy, suffocating weight dropped over the space, and Alpha's pure, unadulterated dominance. Several younger wolves nearby dropped to their knees, gasping. Maeve felt it press against her lungs, but strangely, it didn't crush her. The bond wrapped around her like a shield, filtering the oppressive weight into a dull, vibrating hum. "She is my mate," Kalen said softly. The quietness of his voice made it infinitely more terrifying. "If I catch anyone looking at her like she's a stray dog again, I will rip their eyes out and feed them to the crows. Am I understood?" Arlo swallowed hard, exposing his throat submissively. "Yes, Alpha." Kalen turned back, his posture instantly relaxing, from warlord back to exhausted man. He caught Maeve's eye. She was staring at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He gave a brief, barely perceptible nod, then continued walking toward the main keep. Maeve followed, keeping her chin raised, despite the trembling in her legs. His quarters were at the highest point of the fortress, a massive room built of dark stone, dominated by a huge hearth where a fire already roared. The floor was covered in thick pelts. The air smelled of dried herbs, parchment, and him. He shut the heavy oak door behind them. The silence of the room was sudden and absolute, broken only by the crackle of the flames. Kalen walked over to a heavy wooden table, unbuckling his sword belt and dropping it with a loud clatter. He braced his hands on the wood, hanging his head between his shoulders, his breath coming in a ragged sigh. He looked entirely spent. Maeve stood awkwardly by the door. She didn't know what to do with her hands. "You didn't have to threaten them," she muttered, picking at a frayed thread on her cloak. "I'm used to the looks." "You won't get them here," he replied without looking up. "Not from them, not from me." A knock sounded at the door. Two servants hurried in, carrying steaming buckets of water, filling a large copper tub in the corner before hastily retreating, leaving a tray of bread and roasted meat on a side table. Kalen pushed himself off the table. He walked over to a massive wardrobe, pulled out a thick, clean woolen tunic, and tossed it onto the bed. "Wash," he told her, his voice devoid of any predatory inflection. "Eat, sleep." He turned toward the door. "Where are you going?" The question slipped out before Maeve could bite it back. Kalen paused, his hand on the iron door handle. He looked back at her over his shoulder. The exhaustion in his face was deeply human, cracking the terrifying alpha facade he wore outside. "I have a border war to manage and reports to read," he said dryly, "and you need to sleep without sleeping with one eye open. The bond is a tether, not a cage. I won't force my presence on you." He opened the door, but stopped, leaning his head against the heavy wood for a fraction of a second. "You aren't unfit, Maeve. They were just too blind to see what it takes to survive the cold. But I see it." The heavy door clicked shut behind him. Maeve stood alone in the quiet, warm room. The scent of roasted meat made her stomach clench violently, but for the first time in days, the hollow emptiness in her chest didn't ache quite so fiercely. She looked at the copper tub, the steam curling into the air. She walked over to the makeshift boot on her right foot. She carefully untied Kalen's heavy leather gauntlet, setting it gently on the stone hearth to dry. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't healed. The scars of her rejection still burned raw and ugly beneath her skin. She didn't love the gruff, scarred king who had dragged her out of the mud. But as she shed her freezing, blood-stained clothes and stepped into the scalding water, letting the heat finally melt the ice in her marrow, She realized something profound. He hadn't asked her to be soft. He hadn't asked her to be a fragile Luna to stand behind his throne. He had asked her to survive. And looking down at the calluses on her own hands, Maeve knew she could do that. They would survive the winter, together.